Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier about what the kind of core platforms that people have in place at the moment, source to pay,
Mhm.
procure to pay,
Right.
kind of workflows, they have the scope for additional granularity to be added underneath them. So whether they
Mhm.
are the master supplier record, but there's some additional supplier criteria being looked at around ESG, for example, on a more gradual level by a specific platform, or whether in services, for example, you're handling your MSA and your contract lifecycle and risk management within a source to pay platform, but if you call off a statement of work, you're going a level below, or if in the buying of goods and materials, you're punching out in an Amazon type scenario. I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of scope to just add in that additional layer, because ultimately it comes back round to the data side of it, which is another area that is massively changing.
Yes. No, and I still don't know. This is a big question mark in my mind. When it comes to data, data is going to be the connector of all these systems, right? It's what's going to feed the engine of this platform working. But there's, I think, a debate, and a healthy one, that needs to be had within procurement, is around what what is that, like the main record that we're going to build this off of. Is it going to be the supplier and build around the supplier and that relationship with the supplier and contracts with that supplier, the spend, and how we're, who's using that supplier in the organization, what's their ESG scores, all of that. But then I've also heard the whole debate around, no, it's going to be around the contract, and the contract is going to have all of that information surrounding it. I still don't know which way that's going to play out, but I think when it comes to data, I think there's just going to be this foundational connector point for the data, so that we can see a holistic picture of whatever activity is going on within procurement. I personally, I originally thought it was going to be supplier, but then when I heard some people talking about contract, and I was like, well, that could make sense too. So I'm not sure which way it's going to go.
It's a really, really interesting point. It's got my mind whirring. In the stuff that we've done around supply performance, I'd say it's kind of both. And if you think of the data,
Yeah.
so you've got the data that is associated with that supplier, but that supplier's data is always going to be associated with the contracts they've been engaged in to deliver materials, goods, or services, whatever it might be. So I almost see the data as like this kind of cloud of information that is relevant to the supplier, but the performance is related to their delivery against the contracts. So it feels like it's potentially like a crossover area. And I think
Yeah.
the way that data is handled more now is in this type of scenario where it is a cloud of data and insights are pulled and manipulated in different ways. But ultimately, what it comes down to is capturing the data, which
Mm-hmm.
in some cases can be extremely difficult, where processes kind of dip offline, or for example, contracts are not stored digitally. I mean, some organizations would regard the digital storage of a contract being a scanned PDF sitting in a file. Okay, it might be in a PDF. That doesn't mean it's digital. So that is it. I feel like with some companies, and it'd be interesting to know what you see in this area, it feels like there's a long way to go. Even if they've got top level systems in place, their data can still be quite scarce.
Yeah, and it has been for it's been a challenge since I started in procurement. I remember going to a conference. My gosh, it was probably around 2014, and they were talking about how, because we don't have good data, we can't digitally transform, because we don't have that layer of foundation to build off of. And I got so frustrated about that conversation and the seat at the table conversation during that conference, that's what actually launched me into LinkedIn and writing blogs and doing all of this work, because I was like, oh, we can't, we gotta get off this. Like, we gotta figure it out. Either we're asking the wrong question, or we just like the answer to the questions that we've been asking for the last 20 years. And so when it comes to data, I think I like the I think we have enough data where we can do what we need to do today, right? However, there's going to be a very large shift in our thought process around how we connect all of the dots. And I think that lake, kind of that cloud concept, is interesting. But like, if I were to walk into an organization today and just randomly pick a supplier out of a pot, right? Here's a vendor number that you have in your organization. Tell me tell me everything that you know about that supplier with just looking at data today. Like, are we connecting to that supplier record the contracts, their scores, their risk scores? Can we quickly pull up their spend? Can we look at who's using that supplier and how often? Like, I think that's going to be, we have all of those elements for the most part. There's some organizations that don't, like you mentioned on the contracts, which I'll get to in a little second. But I think we need to start thinking about connecting the dots. And then once we understand what that landscape you want to create looks like, we can start filling in the holes of where we do have holes in that landscape. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
In my head, it kind of feels like what you need to be able to do is grab a supplier, and when you pull that supplier closer to have a look at them, it drags all of the data points that are connected to that organization. Exactly as you say, the top level data points around that organization, and then the data points around what they've been doing for you and with you. And I think the connecting the dots thing is interesting, particularly as at the moment, there are more dots being added.
Yes.
So it's quite a fluid process, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's something that I think organizations need to be strategic about and start thinking about, okay, if I have this landscape, how does it look today? And how do we want it to look in the future? And then that might be part of your driving factor around what technologies you want to even to invest in, right? What data are you missing in that picture, and how can we acquire it? Or do we have it today, a scanned PDF contract? And we have a great starting point, but it's not really giving us the data that we need. How do we get to the data in the future and think about that differently? And that might drive an investment within procurement to get that done.